I would say even now, team, that you could be muted. You can mute yourself, and it's much easier.
Yeah, my cough reminded me to mute, so I am muting now.
Thanks, Matt. I don't see any Johnny Cash art in your study there, Matt.
On the wall behind me are my heroes, Christopher Isherwood and W.H. Auden.
Oh, I love
photos from the British Portrait Gallery, actually. Yeah.
Great.
But I've been listening to Billy Joe Shaver all day. You know, rest in peace.
Yeah, I love W.H. Auden about more than anything. All right, we're almost there. Margie, some water, please. Thanks so much. Well, good evening, one and all, and welcome to the second in our fall series on Catholic thought, citizenship, and the common good. Our event tonight is called Catholic Vote 2020. How will faith be a factor? And I am truly looking forward to this conversation. My name is Michael Murphy, and it's my great honor to serve as the director of the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage. And on behalf of university leadership, and on behalf of Commonweal Magazine, and the Mundelein College Alumni Association, who are co-sponsoring this event, I extend a very hearty greeting to you all. A kind welcome also from our dedicated center staff, Center Manager Megan Toomey, Graduate Student Assistant Kathleen McNutt, and our devoted undergraduate assistants, Catherine and Francis. They are most instrumental in getting all of our events from farm to table, and I remain very grateful for their superb work. As mentioned, this event is the second in a trio of fall events that considers the Catholic vote broadly writ. You know, at roughly 23% of the population, Catholics are the second largest religious voting bloc in the US. They are particularly relevant this year because of candidate Biden, Joe Biden, and his Catholic faith, and the issues in play at our political moment, our current moment, I'll say, from the care of the neighbor and care of creation to issues in play with SCOTUS appointments. Still, as we have seen, Catholics are too large to consider as a monolithic group. They are not only split on candidates and issues, but they're also split about what might constitute a Catholic vote or voter at all. Given these realities, you know, the questions really open up, and they open up to the larger arena of everybody's two favorite topics, religion and politics. So tonight, we will be taking all of this on as we try to understand more clearly the relationship among voters, faith, and politics. Just some housekeeping before I introduce our esteemed speakers, of whom I'm so glad they accepted our invitation. That was an awkward construction. I'll be looking at that later. In any case, please be our guest. This week's kind of big. We're getting close to the election. We have lots of things for you to think about. And so we have 3 events to feature in the short term. Tomorrow is our Tara Deschardins, SJ, Fellow in Catholic Studies lecture. The great Stephen P. Millies from Catholic Theological Union at Chicago, and he's the director of the Bernardine Center there. He's going to be delivering his much anticipated talk, The Gift of Our People, a fresh look at our faithful citizenship in a foreboding moment. You won't want to miss this, people. Then, for All Saints Day, a true saint will be among us, in the Zoom space that is. the great historian from Georgetown, Father John O'Malley, will present a talk called Venerating the Saints, an Ancient Tradition Alive Today. This event is hosted by the Lumen Christi Institute, the Bollandist Society, and America Media, and is co-sponsored by the Hank Center, among a host of others. Finally, on Thursday, November 5th, our fall series concludes with Catholic Vote 2020, Results, Reflection, Renewal. Now, the votes may not yet be counted, but we have an excellent panel who will help us navigate the terrain about what is transpiring. Molly Andalina from DePaul, Amanda Bryan from Loyola, Miguel Diaz from Loyola, Steve Millies again, and Bernard Prusak, known to Commonweal readers from King's College. This evening's Zoomcast is a webinar, so just some notes on this. This means that the chat is disabled for those who are familiar to the Zoom space, but the Q&A feature is alive and well. So we encourage you to write any comment or question when you click on that Q&A tab, write it there. I encourage you to listen actively as our speakers speak, and then comment as you want, because it might be more dynamic that way. We can all check the Q&A as it goes. I'll be collating them, and then I'll break in during the Q&A and comment part, fittingly, and I'll group some questions together so we can get as many people and your voices as is possible. So without further ado, it's time to welcome our speakers. These are the briefer biographies, and please do check our web pages for the fuller profiles of our honored guests. We have first Professor Kathleen Keaveney, a scholar who focuses on the relationship of law, religion, and morality, and she serves as the Darrell and Juliet Libby Professor at Boston College, a position that includes appointments in both the Department of Theology and in the law school. She is the first faculty member to hold such a joint appointment. Kathy was the 2018-2019 Carrie and Ann McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Kluge Center of the Library of Congress. Among her books are Prophecy Without Contempt, Religious Discourse in the Public Square, that was from Harvard in 2016, and more recently, Ethics at the Edges of Law, Christian Moralists and the American Legal Tradition. That was out of Oxford University Press from 2018. Our next guest is Matthew Sitman, who is the Associate Editor of Commonweal Magazine. He writes regularly for Dissent, where he also serves on the editorial board, and his work has been published at the New Republic, The Bias, and other publications. He is the co-host of the most excellent podcast, Know Your Enemy, which is it's a podcast about American conservatism and really much more. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matthew Sitman. Finally, great friend to the Hank Center, Kenneth Woodward, who served as religion editor at Newsweek for 38 years, during which he reported on a wide variety of subjects from 7 continents. In addition to some 100 cover stories and 700 other articles for Newsweek, Ken has published essays, articles, and book reviews in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Commonweal, and First Things, among other publications. Mr. Woodward is the author of 4 books, including his recently published Getting Religion, Faith, Culture, and Politics from the Age of Eisenhower to the Ascent of Trump. He has lectured at some 70 colleges and universities in the US and Europe. He currently serves now as writer in residence at the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago. So we're going to go in the order of Kathy, and then Matt, and then Ken. Each will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll open it up to some questions and integrate your question and comments as well. So for now, thank you, Kathy. The stage is yours.
Great. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. All right. Well, what I see my job here is as trying to present a little bit of what Catholic teaching is, that's going to provide a bit of background and context for some of our discussions, and even a basis for some of the disputes that we will talk about among Catholic voters later on in our webinar. So the thing to remember about Catholic teaching is that it's an understanding of religion that differs a little bit from what's prominent in the US. It isn't just a religion of private feeling or of interior life. Catholic teaching is social, and it's facing outward toward the whole community, not just toward members of the particular Catholic faith who happen to be around to listen to a particular sermon or a particular preacher. So what are the elements of Catholic social teaching in a nutshell? There are lots of different lists, but I like the one with 7 on it because it's got resonances. First, you've got the life and the dignity of the human person. Every human person has dignity because they're made in the image and likeness of God. Second, you have a call to family, community, and participation. We're not meant to be hermits. We're meant to live together with one another in families and communities, with friends and other kinds of groups. We have not only rights, but also responsibilities. Point 4 is that when we think about how we should organize our lives together, how we should articulate our rights and our responsibilities, we have an option for the poor and the vulnerable. Point 5 is we believe that work has a dignity. It isn't just a burden. It shouldn't be just a burden. And we believe in the rights of workers. Point 6 is solidarity. We're all really responsible for all, as Pope John Paul II said. And point 7 is we have a responsibility not merely to care for other human beings, but also to care for God's creation, which is something that Pope Francis has emphasized so much. So you have these 7 points, and they're all important, but how do you integrate them? How do you think about them together? I think we have a forest and a trees problem here. If you think about the 7 points of Catholic social teaching, you're thinking about the trees. How do you describe the forest? Well, in Catholic social teaching, you might say the forest is the common good. It's the ground and the goal of the elements of Catholic social teaching. It's what Pope John the 23rd described as the sum total of social conditions that allow people, either as individuals or as groups, to reach their fulfillment more easily and more fully. Now, that's a fairly vague understanding, and there's a lot of work that's been done trying to specify what this might mean. But you get the idea intuitively that the idea is the good for all of us and each of us, and all of us and each of us together. So the common good really is the impetus for integrating and organizing the various components of Catholic social teaching. Now, here is, I think, where we can begin to identify some of the challenges of taking Catholic social teaching and putting it into a voting guide or an election guide. The bishops have been trying to do this now since 1976, so 44 years. And if you compare the very first one, which was called Political Responsibility, Reflections in an Election Year, to the more recent one, which is called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship in 2020, you'll see what I think you could call kind of writing the middle-age spread of a document. The first document was about 3,000 words long. It identified 8 issues in alphabetical order, and only in alphabetical order: abortion, economy, food policy, housing, human rights, mass media, military expenditures. There was no ranking of issues, and there was a single author, John Carr. Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship has about 18,000 words. It identifies over 50 issues and sub-issues, and it's got a confusing ranking. We're told on the one hand that abortion is preeminent, but we're also told we can't be a single issue voter. It reads like what it is, which is a committee document. But I think one of the bigger problems in all of this is that it is too focused in a way on issues. We talk about voting and issues, but what is an issue? It could be a complex problem with many causes, like hunger or global warming, an entire section of social life, the economy, or even a morally objectionable practice such as illegal drug use or abortion. There are many different ways that you can specify what an issue is, and in some ways they don't actually correspond to one another. You can't quite compare them. A second issue with issues is that they're hard to rank. You have, on the one hand, important issues, and then you also have urgent issues. So think of as an important issue as something you really have to address. It's foundational. And a good example would be if you had a house whose foundation is cracking. You got to fix that. Otherwise, the whole house will collapse. But even if you have a house with a cracked foundation, you also have to pay attention to urgent issues. You got a cracked foundation. That's important. You've got a house with a roof on fire. That's urgent. You got to put out the fire first. And so I think one of the things voters struggle with is how do we really relate important issues to urgent issues? How do we rank them? I think in 2007, 2008, people thought the economy was an urgent issue. There were many other important issues, but the economy was something that had to be fixed first. And a third issue with issues is we need to expect the unexpected. If you think about the presidents we've elected in the 20th century, or 21st century rather, they've all had to deal with something we didn't expect them to have to deal with. President George W. Bush had to deal with the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Barack Obama had to deal with the Great Recession, and Donald Trump had to deal with the coronavirus. So we're actually in a situation where I think the way the bishops have framed, and it's not just the bishops, it's pretty much everyone who puts out a voting guide, has framed our obligation, is it puts us in a situation where we really can't have a discussion or an argument with one another because we're throwing issues at one another and we're labeling them important or urgent or paramount or non-negotiable. And so I think that if we as Catholics are going to make progress in thinking about the task of voting and what it means to be a Catholic voter, I think we need to think in different ways, which I will talk about in the question and answer, but really comes to thinking seriously about the fact that actually what we're doing is voting for candidates, not for issues. So why don't I just stop there and turn it on to Matt Sitman, who can pick up and focus us in on what's going on in this election.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathy. I hope everyone can hear me fine. I live in New York City, and Spectrum Internet is, a constant source of consternation for us. So I hope I'm coming through clear. But I want to begin by thanking the Murph, as we call him, and the Hank Center for inviting me to be on this panel. I think the work Mike does and that the Hank Center does is really superb and a bright spot in the Catholic firmament. And Mike mentioned that tomorrow Steve Millies is giving an address, and I just want to encourage everyone to tune into that because I think Steve Millies is just one of the really wonderful, thoughtful Catholic commentators out there. And furthermore, I'm humbled to be on this panel with Ken and Kathy. Kathy's someone I revere. I work with her at Commonweal, and so I'm well acquainted with how just brilliant she is. And Ken is someone, every time he publishes in Commonweal, I learn something from him. So I consider myself the junior partner in this panel, and hope I hold up my end. And I would just say that I think my role tonight is to be a little bit more of the election pundit. And one of the things I discussed with Mike beforehand is that I grew up a conservative. I'm kind of an ex-conservative, and I grew up in Trump country in central Pennsylvania. So I want to talk a little bit about where I'm from and kind of how I see some of that playing out. And one of the things I would say is that I grew up in Blair County, which is right in the middle of Pennsylvania. It's very close to where Penn State is at, for those not familiar with the geography of the state. You might recall James Carville's line that in Pennsylvania, there's Pittsburgh in the west, Philadelphia in the east, and in between is Alabama. That's So I grew up in the Alabama part of Pennsylvania, and one of the things that's really striking about that to me is that I was not surprised that Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016, and I was not totally surprised that he won the general election in 2016. I didn't necessarily predict that, but I wasn't surprised by it. And one of the things I saw was just how much energy Trump was generating in the parts of the country like where I grew up. So for example, in 2008, when John McCain ran against Barack Obama, McCain got about 60% of the vote in Blair County, where I'm from. And Mitt Romney got about 65, 66%, and Donald in 2012, and then in 2016, Donald Trump actually won about 71% of the vote in the county where I'm from. So as I said, this is really Trump country. And one of the things I've tried to do is, as a writer about politics, is not claim some special knowledge into the mind of Trump voters or kind of the pulse of the country. I've lived in New York now for maybe about 7 years. I am in a bubble in some ways. And I don't, again, claim to be a kind of Trump whisperer. Where I grew up,
Matt's frozen right now on my screen.
two
Is he
religious
frozen?
groups.
Sorry, Matt. You're getting a little bit spotty there, but keep on going.
Okay, I apologize. One of the things in terms of religious faith and its role in the election that I was thinking about is that there were kind of two religious groups mostly where I grew up. One of which were kind of ethnic Catholics, or what we used to call ethnic Catholics, like my Italian Catholic grandmother. And the other was fundamentalist Christians. And I actually promised Ken that I would offer a Billy Graham anecdote during this conversation. And that is, when I was a teenager, I read Billy Graham's autobiography, Just As I Am. And he said that early in his ministry, when he came to central Pennsylvania, his reception was so negative from the fundamentalist Christians where I grew up that he almost quit the ministry. And where I'm going with that is to say that one of the things I find fascinating about that is that this county where I grew up, which is both a place where Catholics, there are a lot of, again, ethnic Catholics and a lot of fundamentalist Christians, they're both voting for Trump. And one of the things I would sort of deduce from that is that I think, in line with some of what Ken's argued, and I don't want to steal too much of his thunder, but one of the things I would say is that we're seeing that despite certain theological distinctives, politically, both of these groups, Protestant and Catholic, are turning out in huge numbers for Trump. And again, that Trump generated a sort of enthusiasm among kind of both sets of voters that wasn't shocking to me, but that really is notable. So in terms of the Catholic vote, one of the things I just want to say is that it seems like it's pretty evenly split. And I'm not even sure to what extent it makes a lot of sense to talk about a distinct Catholic vote. The Catholic vote kind of seems to track the country more generally, and whoever wins tends to pull the Catholic vote their way a bit. And there's not anything terribly distinctive about it. So, you know, the experiences of where I grew up and the kind of voting patterns of the kinds of places where I grew up, I think it speaks to kind of an urban rural and or urban/suburban and rural divide. And that's one part of it. And that really, I think, matters for our political system right now. But I'm not sure it speaks to a faith divide necessarily. But I did want to make one kind of point where I think the faith really will come into this election. And it's not in terms of demographics and voting patterns and behavior. It has more to do with Joe Biden's faith itself. And in particular, I think right now, what we're seeing is that this election in a lot of ways seems to be hinging on the pandemic. And we're facing a situation where 200,000 Americans, 200,000, I mentioned that 200,000 more could be dead by the end of the year. And I think the fact that Joe Biden is himself a person of faith, a line I like to use is that he wears his faith on his sleeve just as he wears the rosary around his wrist. He's a man whose grief that he's experienced, the tragedy that he's experienced, I think really is a part of his public persona. And to that end, because we are, in a sense, a nation grieving right now, I don't want to say that the Catholic vote is going to matter in a very particular way, but I think the fact that Joe Biden is a person of faith, whose experience of grief and tragedy is inextricably bound up with his faith, that really matters. And I think he's been able to channel that as a candidate. And I'm not going to make a prediction about who's going to win or what the final numbers might be, but I would say that if Biden does win, a significant element of that will be, for one thing, he, as I said, again, has channeled kind of the grief and suffering of the country, or transmuted it kind of through his own personal grief, suffering, and tragedy. And I also would say that because he has this kind of older affect as a Catholic of a certain generation, of an Irish Catholic, as he might say, I think it does make him a little bit harder to categorize ideologically. And one of the things we've seen is that if you look at, say, the research of Erica Chenoweth, a political scientist at Harvard, she's pointed out that, and I think this kind of applies to our situation now, in contexts where an authoritarian leader is sort of pushed out, the successful cases of that often involve not a kind of left-wing vanguard leading some sort of revolution again. It's on a
Okay, I think Matt, we're gonna hope for you to finish your thought, Matt, because you're onto something here. But you're getting choppy, and so why don't we table your insights for a moment, and then ask Ken to speak, and you can work your triage how you will, and then we'll circle back. Okay, so thank you, Ken. Thank you, Matt, and then please welcome Ken to the Zoom stage.
Well, thank you, Mike. I want to mention that I'm in between eye surgery, so if I'm a bit halting in my reading, please bear with me. One of the unfortunate aspects of Zoom conferences is the inability of speakers to ask for a show of hands from the audience, something I like to do from time to time to get a sense of who is it I'm talking to. So in lieu of hand raising, I'm going to make some guesses about who you are. Nearly all of you are white. Most of you are graduates of a four-year college. Perhaps a third of you have a graduate or a professional degree. Those of you who are at least 30 years old with a full-time job have a household income of at least $70,000 a year, a very comfortable living in the southern Midwestern and rural areas where most white evangelicals, for example, live. Most of you live in a northern city or suburb with good public schools available. Many of you attended private schools yourselves. Way more of you watch Stephen Colbert than Tucker Carlson, listen to NPR rather than talk radio, watch Wimbledon rather than WrestleMania. If I'm right so far, then it is easy to predict that most of you are not voting for Donald Trump. But note, I did not ask you whether you practice a religion, though I suspect that most of you identify as Catholic. I didn't ask because, and this is the main point of my remarks tonight, I do not believe that religion is a significant factor in this presidential election. Wasn't in the last one, and very rarely has been in American election history. More precisely, I argue that religion is most certainly not an independent factor in our politics. And those journalists and pollsters and academics who treat it as such obscure the extent to which the political or politics conditions American religion rather than the reverse. Now, if I'm right, it follows that the concept of a Catholic vote lacks any heuristic value because it presumes that being Catholic determines how a Catholic votes. That assumption has some predictive value while the Roosevelt's New Deal coalition lasted, when leadership of the labor unions and many Democratic Party bosses were Catholic. But it has had no value, at least since the early 70s, when the reforms of the McGovern Commission on Party Structure and Delegate Selection effectively jettisoned the white and heavily Catholic working class vote for those of the college educated and suburbanites. No surprise then that in 2016, Trump rode the white working class to his electoral college victory. Moreover, religion is inherently social, as Kathy talked about. It involves belonging as well as believing and behaving. So unless a poll tells us how often self-identifying Catholics attend Mass, for example, we have no grounds for assuming that religion is a driver of their vote. Now, let's talk about the kind of people who are not tuned into this Zoom event, specifically white evangelical voters. Recall, one of the most frequently cited statistics coming out of the last presidential election was that 81% of white evangelicals who, according to exit polls, voted for Donald Trump. I'm sorry about that. I thought I turned that off. Since then, white evangelicals have been identified as the core of Trump's constituency. But are they? And who are they? Among the many weaknesses of exit polls, the chief one is that they may give you a rough snapshot of how various groups voted, but they do not tell us why. Like many more sophisticated polls that also rely solely on religious self-identification, they presume what they need to demonstrate. In this case, that being evangelical is why these folks voted the way they did. But as I argued in a recent Commonweal essay, there are a number of reasons other than religion that better explain the so-called white evangelical vote. Geography, already mentioned, is one. Another is habit. White evangelicals have been part of the Republican coalition now for 10 straight presidential elections. Education is really key. White evangelicals are more likely than other white Christians to have finished their schooling with, at best, a high school diploma. That in turn largely determines their social class and caste, just above African Americans, according to Isabel Wilkerson's new book, and in felt competition with them. Related to this, of course, is economics. A third of white evangelicals earned less than $30,000 a year in 2016, at a time when the poverty rate line started at $24,250 for a couple with 2 children. And more than half, 57%, earned less than $50,000 a year. Like most blue-collar workers, they hadn't seen a real wage increase since the 1970s, when Trump promised to make America great again. A large number of white working class voters, especially in the Rust Belt states, heard more jobs, better pay. This evening, though, I want to question the legitimacy of the very category white evangelical vote. The category was created by pollsters after the 1972 election as a way to account politically for the mostly non-denominational Southern white fundamentalists who abandoned their traditional antipathy toward party politics to support their fellow born-again Christian Jimmy Carter. There was some justification for the category back then, but a good deal less, I think, today. Political scientists have since learned that the terms evangelical and born again lack precision as markers of religious identity. Corwin Schmidt and others have found that at least 20% of Christians who identify as born again are actually Catholics. As an adjective, evangelical describes a wide range of otherwise unconnected Christians, from the Amish in Iowa to California Quakers to some Minnesota Lutherans to Florida Pentecostals to members of Joel Osteen's megachurch, where they imbibe a prosperity gospel that is not easily reconciled with the real one. That's why I define evangelicalism as an imaginary community of mostly post-denominational Christians in which almost anyone who claims to be born again can be assigned. Finally, we should not forget that classic evangelicalism of a Billy Graham, say, is inherently entrepreneurial. It is free enterprise in religion and thus has a natural affinity with free enterprise capitalism. You can actually trace that history, and I think I did that in my book, Getting Religion. Evangelical clergy do not work their way up an ecclesiastical ladder. They typically go out and build up a congregation from scratch, like Falwell did and others. And if they fail at that, they turn to selling shoes or stocks or just themselves on television. The fundamental problem I have with polls on religion and politics is polling itself. In Inventing American Religion, published in 2015, sociologist Robert Wolfnow plumbed the hazards that plague opinion polls: flawed methodology, imprecise definitions, poorly framed questions, and especially declining response rates. In effect, drawing sweeping conclusions based on the mere 9% of cooperative people who happen to answer their phones. Put another way, you can learn a lot more about white evangelical Christians from reading a book like Hillbilly Elegy than you can from reading the books of a pollster like Robert P. Jones. Not only do polls of people who identify with some religious label or other tell us nothing much about themselves, they also invite their antagonists to fill in the blanks. That's because, as political scientist Liliana Mason has shown, party identity has so completely absorbed our other identities that, quote, a single vote can now indicate a partisan preference, as well as his or her religion, race, ethnicity, gender, neighborhood, and favorite grocery store. In his insightful book of a year ago, Why We Are Polarized, Ezra Klein illustrated the absorbent power of political partisanship. His wry example is a television ad run by a conservative group against liberal presidential primary candidate, Democrat Howard Dean, in 2004. In the television ad, a reporter stops an elderly white couple in the street to ask about Dean's plan to raise taxes. The husband replies, quote, well, I think Howard Dean should take his tax hiking, government spending, latte drinking, sushi eating, Volvo driving, New York Times selling. Then his wife cuts in, body piercing, Hollywood loving, left-wing freak show back to Vermont where it belongs, end of quote. Now, if we were not meeting in Zoomland, I would love to ask some of you what comes spontaneously to your mind when you hear that term, white evangelical Christian. Those of us who write and teach and talk about religion, those of us, that is, who have some form of skinny in the game, are loath to acknowledge the facts of our political life. So are legions of preachers and pastors. But the plain fact is that the faith factor is marginal to who gets to be president and who does not. Thank you.
Ken, thank you very much. Very provocative. And I want to thank all three of our speakers. We're going to ask Matt to pick up where he left off. He and I have been communicating surreptitiously in the chat. So Matt, please do continue.
Yes, I apologize for my internet problems. It's, just short of 9 p.m. here in New York City. So internet usage is it's kind of high watermark. And I think that was part of the problem. But I wanted to pick up with one point, kind of the main point I wanted to make actually after some of the introductory comments I made, which was that it's actually kind of useful to come on the heels of Ken's comments because I agree with all of them. I think he's right about the perils of kind of treating the faith vote a certain way or looking to polling in a certain sense. And so what I was driving at is that I think faith will matter in this election to the extent it does, not because we can necessarily parse the behavior of different demographic groups, especially Catholics, who I think, again, are just sort of representative of the broader culture. They're a kind of bellwether more than anything else. And but where I think faith will matter is that Joe Biden himself is a man of faith. And we're a country looking right now at over 200,000 people dead from the pandemic. In the last debate, Joe Biden pointed out that 200,000 more could possibly be dead by the end of the year. And Biden is a man who wears his own personal griefs and tragedies and suffering kind of on his sleeve, just as he wears his son, Beau Biden, who died of brain cancer. He wears his rosary around his wrist. And I think Biden as kind of griever in chief actually is a major source of his appeal. This is not a very ideological election in some ways. I think the pandemic changed that. It means that I think a lot of people are looking for someone with a broad kind of competency, someone a lot of people trust. And so if Biden wins, it will not be because he's converted the people who live where I grew up, who are kind of extraordinarily Trumpy. It's not that he's going to kind of win over rural voters necessarily. I think it'll be because there is some kind of middling voter, especially white women who live in the suburbs, who just want someone competent, who knows what they're doing, and who they basically trust to do what's right and handle this really extraordinary situation with more just knowledge of how the levers of power work. And I would just say one kind of further point to that end, and I'll hand it over to Murph. I think the fact that Biden's Catholic and kind of an older Catholic, an Irish Catholic, as he would say, it means I think he's kind of scrambled certain ideological categories for people. He has a bit of the Scranton affect, even if some of his record as a senator and vice president is what I would call, tending toward the neoliberal. So I think in that sense, my take is that the way faith will matter in this election is, again, not via demographics, but because Joe Biden himself is a man of faith. And if he wins, I think some of the qualities that come from that will be a major part of his appeal to the electorate.
It's really interesting, Matt, and that's going to be a good segue. The scrambled nature you mentioned is interesting because you can get a scrambled nature, Ken citing J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, which scrambles people's expectations of white evangelicals quite thoroughly. And I'm reading a book right now that I recommend highly. I'm halfway through. It's called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumez. I think Dumez, D-U-M-E-Z, that I recommend heartily. But then I also think about these kind of cartoonish white evangelicals that we get. But sometimes it's not all that cartoonish. I think about that group when Bill Clinton was guilty of moral turpitude in the 90s. And that same group is given Donald Trump pass after pass after pass. So there's something that needs to be reckoned with there. Yeah. And maybe we go to Kathy on that, because Kathy, you've written extensively on these types of relationships between autonomy, solidarity, but also on the virtues. And so when we come to these virtues of these two candidates before us, how do you navigate that? What advice might you give us who are tuning into your insights?
Oh, well, thank you. First, I just want to, I was very fascinated by Matt's comments and, of course, Ken's comments. And I totally agree. And I've made some of those points citing Ken's article and other talks I've given recently. But what is interesting is that politicians still wrap their claims to religious voters in religious terms. So it's not as if anybody says, well, just forget about your religion, vote your social status, or vote your pocketbook. We still want to be able to frame what we're doing in some way, at least to ourselves, and maybe it's delusional, as consonant with some broader teachings, because that allows us to see ourselves as as good people. And I think that is something interesting. So on the Bill Clinton side thing, you know, how do you distinguish between Bill Clinton and somebody like Donald Trump? Well, one way you can do it is look at the way some evangelical Protestants have framed him as Cyrus of Persia. You know, I mean, we've got the whole biblical imagination. So he's a non-believer. He is somebody who, you know, isn't committed to the faith tradition, but just like Cyrus rescued the beleaguered Jews from, you know, from the Babylonians. So we're seeing, in their view, Donald Trump, not part of the system, but still an instrument of God to rescue a beleaguered lifestyle. And I think religion is sort of part of that lifestyle. We tend to go very dichotomous. We tend to go very Manichaean, good versus evil, in thinking about the party system at this point. And giving a religious overlay to that, whether it's what actually motivates voters, helps solidify the fact, well, I'm going to vote for this person. I couldn't possibly vote for the other person because they're part of the culture of death. They're, you know, they're the baddies, as the English would say. Now, to just segue to your question, I would say, you know, and I guess I'm a white, you know, woman from, you know, the suburbs, right? So I'm looking at character, but I think that character is a place that we should start rather than issues. And I've argued that, you know, I mean, and these aren't religious values. I would say this is almost like common morality reflections. You know, competence matters. You got to have somebody who can actually do the job. And I think part of the problem with Donald Trump is not so much what his values are, but it doesn't look like he's up to the task. It doesn't look like he really wants to do the job. It looks like he wants to play golf. You know, character, I think, is important. Do you have a good character? Are you committed to the well-being of other people? Are you at least basically honest? And then I think collaboration matters as well in this time. I think people are looking to Biden because I think he's not exacerbated the culture war issues. Like, for example, on the Supreme Court, he's not gone, you know, ballistic yet. He said, well, I'm going to think about that. We'll see what's going to happen. He seems to be somebody who you can work with. And then also connections. Who are you liable to? Who are you indebted to? Who is going to call in favors when you move into Pennsylvania Avenue? And those are the places I think we should start thinking. And I think that'll help us maybe not fight as much as Catholics or as voters by saying, well, abortion's the most important issue. And then, no, climate change is the most important issue. And then you end up kind of yelling at each other and thinking each other is, you know, not worth talking to. But maybe if we focus on virtues, we might be able to get to a better place.
Thank you. Hey, Matt, I know you wanted, Kathy, thank you so much. Matt, I wanted to respond. Then please, Ken, jump right in.
Sure. I wanted to kind of echo Kathy's point. And in particular, she mentioned the way politicians still feel the need to kind of wrap themselves in religion or kind of use religious reference points. And I think that really is quite in line with my comments about Joe Biden earlier. And I want to make a particular kind of a more specific point about that, though, which is that I think part of Biden's appeal right now, to the extent he has the broad appeal he seems to, is that he is able to speak a moral language that is not kind of totally thinned out and desiccated. It's a thick moral language that is rooted in his faith. And I want to give a particular example of that. Just a day or two ago on the campaign trail, he referenced Pope Francis's new encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And that really jumped out at me in part because one of the great themes of that encyclical is dreaming of a different and better world, dreaming of treating each other differently, and kind of not giving in to a certain cynicism and kind of just resignation that nothing better is possible. And I thought of that especially because, you know, Mike, you're in Chicago, Ken, you're in Chicago, I believe. And one of my old teachers who I miss very much and who meant a lot to me was Jean Beth Geilstein, who taught at the Divinity School. at the University of Chicago for many years. And one of the things she always said in her lectures about American political thought was that Dr. King had a dream and not a preference, meaning it was not this kind of social scientific thinned out language of just preferences and nudges and a kind of austere social scientific language. Instead, he spoke the language of dreaming. And I think if we're going to respond to something like mass death in the United States, like the deaths literally of hundreds of thousands of Americans, you have to be able to speak a moral language. And someone like Joe Biden, who can talk about Pope Francis's encyclical or quote Kierkegaard and say, faith sees best in the dark. That is a significant part of, I think, why he's gotten the traction, according to all the polling, that he has so far. It's not a lowest common denominator moral language. It's actually a thick, robust moral language rooted in his specific faith tradition.
I have a feeling you're reading a lot into him. Let me disagree, not for the sake of disagreeing. I don't know. Every time I hear about that rosary in his hand, I think of the Pakistani taxi drivers in New York that have worry beads on the rearview mirror. I don't know that doesn't tell me very much. But I fully agree with you that he exudes empathy. And isn't that what Robert Kennedy did? He exuded empathy, and it was not just picking up his brother's mantle, but also that he had suffered and learned and so on. And I think you're right. I think that personality aspect of the Irish Catholic Pennsylvanian elder statesman, nearly as old as I am, part of him speaks to us, because look at what we've had. I mean, let's be honest, there's one issue and one issue only in the thing, and it's Donald Trump, and that's the way he wants it. But I don't think it's going to turn out the way he wants it to turn out. We've been through a period of harshness and jagged behavior and what's coming next, that kind of thing. I think a lot of people want calm. And again, I think Biden speaks to that. I think that, so it's his manner, I think that is soothing. And that's why he was, for my money, the best of the Democratic candidates. It was precisely that quality. And so people are wanting to trust him, even the people to the left who didn't want him to be the Democratic Party choice. I want to mention one other thing, which is that one has to distinguish between clergy and laity among the evangelicals. And by that, I mean, here I'm putting down polls, but there's rather complete ones done by Christianity Today. And they asked the folks in the pews what was most important to them, and was the pocketbook issues. And when they asked the pastors, it was, abortion and religious freedom and so on. And I think that speaks to something that people like Billy Graham's son, who I think is guilty of elder abuse for the way he treats his father, both when he was alive and since then. When we would get these stories about evangelicals, we always got the same 4 or 5 characters brought in. They go to Billy Graham, Franklin Graham, who doesn't really have a national following, nothing like his father, and he's reversed the whole trajectory of his father's lifetime, of his father's life experience. And they go to, well, he's disgraced now, but Falwell Sr., or Junior, I should say, who's nothing but a businessman and a bit of a con, I think, and then the guy in Dallas. But there's a whole range of people, including megachurch pastors, who don't dare get into politics unless they live in a community where the politics is, where everything is pretty congruent. Then they will. They have nothing
percentage
but loss. And then finally, I wanted to mention this. It just occurred to me. When Franklin Graham complained that Christianity Today had criticized Trump, all right, and he said, "You just are not with the folks." Well, the answer is they aren't. Half of them are go to Episcopal churches, and they're highly educated, and Franklin is none of those things, and the people he appeals to are not highly educated. They're more like the people that I described. So yeah, the divisions in there are enormous.
Hey, can I push back a little bit on, one of the things I've been thinking about is what are the markers of religion? And, so I think that we may have an overly intellectualized conception of religion in some ways, some people on the Catholic right say, well, unless you agree with me on these 7 things and the order in which they should be, you are not a good Catholic, you are a heretic. And it doesn't stop them from even saying this to Pope Francis. So they've got this sort of intellectual, check the box. If you've got this, then you're a Catholic. Practice is, I think, much more important. And so I think, the habits that, that Biden has of going to church every week, of carrying a rosary, of wearing the ashes on Ash Wednesday, of showing up at his granddaughter's first or her confirmation. All of those indicate kind of an authentic view of kind of what a lived Catholic life would look like, that I think that people recognized as, a lived life as a lay person in a religion. It gets complicated, I think, when you get to like the way Mass uses, well, all the real Catholics, all the Catholics who go to Mass every week, they vote for Trump, and all the ones who don't go to Mass every week, don't. Then I think the question really is a challenge for Catholics, such as like, well, why are people going or not going to Mass? Why do people disaffiliate but still consider themselves Catholics? And once Mass attendance is predicated on and is reduced to being a card-carrying member of the Republican Party, I think you've got a snowball devolution of Mass attendance going. So I don't want to reduce. What does it mean to sense that somebody has a religiosity that is tested in suffering, as Matt said, that that isn't just on for the cameras, and that allows him to have a connection with something bigger than all of us, even if you're not totally sure what that is, and he may not even be totally sure. Don't you think we could have a broader conception of religion than just doctrine?
I think that's an excellent one. I have a question that touches that moves towards secularism, but I want to just give a quick minute to Matt or Ken to speak about, because who is in the position to judge somebody's Christianity? That's an original sin of being a Christian in so many ways. But it just seems that Trump is kind of running a game for most people, if we're honest about it. I mean, his spiritual advisor is Paula White Cain, the wife of the former Journey keyboardist, Jonathan Cain, I'll add quickly. But she is a prosperity gospel person. And that clings on the ear of so many kind of Christians of a certain kind. But let me ask this question that came in for Ken, and then I'll leave it. Matt and Kathy and Ken can respond to any of this. This is from Joseph Prabhu. He writes, if Ken Woodward is right, can we say that the U.S. at present is a largely secularized society where religious faith is a contingent and predominantly private marker, like belonging to a tennis or bowling club?
Well, I really don't think we're as nearly as religious as we pretend to be. And I think that's what I said in the Commonweal article. I follow political scientist John Green on this, who says that about 17% of Americans are put religion someplace near the center of their lives. And it seems to me it has to be there if it's going to be a factor in how we, if it's going to be a factor in our politics. I think, if you get a woman who says she's Catholic, she gets up in the morning and does a meditation from a Buddhist handbook, and in the afternoon she or he is on her yoga mat. That's private spirituality. So I'm with Kathy that there's a thickness of belonging, and that you get that in Biden, but I'm not using mass attendance as determining who's Catholic. I'm using it is the extent to which being Catholic means much to them. Because if it seems to me that if you say, well, I'm Catholic, but I don't go to church anymore, or I haven't been there since I was confirmed, you can't begin to say that person's Catholicism is a determinative factor in how they vote. That's all I'm saying.
Matt?
Sure. I don't necessarily disagree with Ken on that point. Although something I've been thinking about a lot lately is that my beloved late Catholic grandmother, who went to mass every week and cooked, hundreds of funeral dinners at her parish, she never once said anything doctrinally to me, or, that even specifically about religious. She just said it matters how you treat people, and that's the most important thing. And I think there are a lot of people who maybe, that sentiment that they share is not always reflected in certain polling data. And I would just make one further point, which is that, again, I think in a lot of ways, I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, which is that whatever kind of you want to do with the statistics about mass attendance, or however you want to parse some of this polling data, I think Biden's ability to speak a kind of more specific, particular language gives him a certain authenticity. And, you can make of that what you will, but I think there's something about Biden that, I was someone who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. I would call myself a democratic socialist even. Biden was not my first choice, but a number of my friends have said, Matt, you really seem to have a soft spot for Biden. And I said, well, yeah, a certain Catholic guy of a certain age. And one of my friends said, oh, like your priests. I said, yes, that's exactly right. And so I think, the fact that Biden's older, which in a lot of ways is not ideal. I
beg your pardon?
No. Well, you have more hair than he does, Ken. I would just say that.
Yeah.
But, I think there is something about Biden that in this particular moment, without the pandemic, I think, the Democrat Biden, I think Trump would be beating Biden right now, actually. That's my strong sense, because
I agree with you.
Without the pandemic, this is, the economy's humming along. Trump has his base with him, and all the people who might be on the margins might lean toward Trump. But I think in this moment, someone like Biden, who is a kind of elder statesman, who has the ability to just let a lot of people trust him, that's the key thing right now. And I do think there's just a way in which that's bound up with his personal qualities, including his faith. And so again, from my perspective, it's not so much the voters' faith that I'm worried about or concerned with or kind of pointing to. It's really Biden's faith and the way he deploys it politically, along with his own personal tragedies and suffering and grief. I think it just makes for a package where he is a kind of trusted elder statesman who might be the person to, in these particular circumstances, be the one to just say, or rather for a lot of people to say, he might not be my first choice. I might not agree with him on everything, but I trust him, and that's enough to get Trump out.
But that also goes back to, maybe I'm going to be the minority here. So Ken, on the going to church, I think the issue of trusting that Matt's bringing up is really important. But don't forget, and this isn't what we're talking about here and now, but I think it has to be mentioned. A lot of Catholics stopped going to church because they stopped trusting the church. Mm-hmm. And they stopped trusting the church because of the sex abuse crisis. And so there was a sense in which, in a way, I think for Catholics like that, and I know a lot of, middle-aged women that just can't take it anymore, partly because of that, partly because of some of the, the kind of the return to a very rigid kind of Catholicism in their view under JP2 and Benedict. But Joe Biden is actually a nostalgic Catholic, right? It brings back a time. He evokes a time before we had problems in all of this respect, right? It's an earlier, a more innocent age that he's kind of conveying, a kind of decency that seems almost, yeah, I mean, in a way, if you say that, that kind of a voter where you're from is looking to go back to the 50s, and I'm not saying they are, but there's a nostalgia for the 50s. Well, Joe Biden can give you that too, right?
Well, look, I position myself as an independent because there's not enough in either party that I like. And so as soon as Biden is president, if he is elected, and I hope he is, I think I have to take the position that I did as a journalist. All right, let's see what he really does. Let's see what he comes up with. I mean, I'm not so sure. And I also want to put in if you will, a kind word for those Catholics and others who do worry about the abortion issue because of what's in the Democratic platform statement. I mean, if they were to act on that platform statement, there'd be an awful lot of people, beginning with me, who would be in really, you'd see a real resistance. I mean, if they were going to make me pay for it, they're going to have it under all circumstances at any time. It's at moments like that that the Democratic Party looks like a wholly owned subsidiary of Planned Parenthood and NARAL. So,
but you've got worries on the other side, I think, particularly among young Catholics. So, we've just had Amy Coney Barrett confirmed to the Supreme Court. And, there was a great hoopla among a certain brand of Catholics for her, ascension to that very, very powerful role. But I think there are a number of Catholics who, might be quite worried about that because, okay, you might say, well, we get rid of Roe v. Wade. And I'm pretty sure she, that will happen with her on the court.
Well, that's a separate issue. This is what.
But wait a minute, but this is why I think the abortion issue has got to be looked at in other contexts. So, but if you get rid of Roe, you also get rid of Obergefell, which gave, which constitutionally protected gay marriage. You might get rid of some of the contraception cases. So, I mean, you've got a bundle of Catholics, and younger Catholics are more supportive of Obergefell, say, than older Catholics, but it's still very hard to see how all of this is going to go. So I think there's a lot of fear on both sides, Ken.
Well, let me jump in here.
I don't disagree.
Let me jump in here with voices from our crowd, and then I want to go to you, Matt, because I know you have some things to say about this. But I want to read you 4 questions that kind of touch, I think, on some of the themes that are being raised in this sector. Just listen, and panelists, write down anything you want to say as I read these questions. This is from Maxwell Pingen. Are liberal/progressive Catholics numerically significant enough in 2020 to deserve their own demographic category? That's question 1. This is from John Nolan. Did Catholics turn Republican when they moved to the suburbs, or were they always Republican? That's question number 2. This is number 3 from Caroline Stanfill, who's with the Felician Sisters of North America. And she wants our panelists to talk about core identity. Many people identify themselves as Democrat or Republican first before they ever say they're a child of God or a Christian or a Catholic. Last one, I think, which resonates with me particularly, from our friend Paul Contino, great professor from Pepperdine. And he asked this: will those who care about life in the womb ever again be welcome in the Democrat Party? If so, how will it happen? And I know, Matt, being from Pennsylvania, all those Bob Kerrey Democrats, all those blue dogs, who there's 23 million of them. How do you think about any of these questions? And off you go.
Sure. Well, I have a few kind of responses to that group of questions, which all were very thoughtful. So I appreciate them. The viewers, I should say, almost said listeners, writing in. One of which is to say that, the question about liberal Catholics, do we constitute a real kind of actual demographic group, or there are enough of us, I'll include myself in that, to constitute a demographic group. And I would say, you know, maybe not, but it's also the case that the 2016 election was decided by what, just a few 100,000 voters. So who knows what constitutes a numerically significant constituency in the United States. I think in certain parts of the country, in certain states that seem to be very important to the outcome of this election, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, et cetera, maybe people who have some religious feeling or some kind of religious identification who find Biden more palatable because of his own faith, maybe that will make a difference. I'm not sure. The question about religious identity and are we kind of children of God first or Republican or Democrat first, I just want to say I was so glad that Ken mentioned earlier Ezra Klein's book on polarization, because it's like empirically undoubtedly true that right now in the United States, your political orientation or affiliation, I should say, matters much more than your faith, or rather it determines the contours of your faith or the way your faith cashes out politically. And that's, I don't know if that's too big of a subject to take on now, but I just want to acknowledge the fact that is in fact the case. And
well, it's also in the case, Matt, pardon me. It's also in the case, Matt, that, you know, even in the Catholic Church, you might say that you're a JP2 Catholic or a Francis Catholic, or, those tribal locations dominate. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's a very, very important topic. We have deeper baked in anthropological locations that, you know, it's more like, where's the grace? We have plenty of nature, but where's the grace? You know, that kind of thing. Did you want to say something more, or Ken or Kathy?
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to respond to Kathy. She's talking about younger Catholics. Christian Smith has done a lot of work on that. Why are little young Catholics growing up not to be older Catholics? And he pretty well explained it. It's really based on the parents, and if the parents aren't particularly Catholic, the kids aren't going to be. That was the factor more than anything else. Parental example, and I think that over the generations, even before the clergy abuse issue, I think mostly clergy abuse issue, that was an excuse for people who, some were really outraged, and you should be outraged. But for a lot of them, it was an excuse to say, I don't want to bother with any of this. So I'm a little ambivalent about that. As Scott Appleby said, the nice thing about the younger generation is they don't discriminate. The unfortunate thing about the younger generation is they don't discriminate. And I think making discriminations is something that is a mark of adulthood. So that would be.
Let me ask Matt. Matt has something to say about younger Catholics. I'm on the chat with him. Matt, what do you think about that?
Well, I would just say when it comes to younger Catholics on the abortion question in particular, I don't like to speak out of my own experience as a kind of, as if I'm speaking for everyone. But I think there's a real reticence to turn to focus exclusively on criminalizing abortion and banning abortion. And that in my experience, there are a lot of younger Catholics who are in fact pro-life, who think that, the way to go is to make sure that mothers have paid maternity leave, who are guaranteed a job when they come back from having a child, who make a living wage, and so support a minimum wage of $15 an hour, and so on. So, I think the abortion question is actually quite tricky right now, and whether you kind of go along with Trump and the Republican Party focusing exclusively on banning it, or whether you think the way to go is through the kind of social provisions and public policy that essentially make having a family easier, to make being someone who's pregnant, being a woman who's pregnant, and basically making it easier for a woman to choose life. I think those are kind of the dilemmas, more than sort of where do you stand on Roe v. Wade, or do you want to criminalize and ban abortion or not? And I think that's especially kind of something that younger Catholics are grappling with right now, because they just don't want to kind of criminalize it in that way. And, they recognize that if you criminalize it, rich women will fly to Mexico to have an abortion performed, whereas the ban will mostly fall on poor women. And so the economic disparities behind some of these questions, I think, are being much more kind of fully wrestled with and grappled with among younger Catholics. And it just makes the abortion question kind of complicated in a way that
it's complicated from a legal point of view. And maybe I'll just pick up on that and pick on that. I mean, I think the problem is that the way the abortion issue has been framed in the discussion and in the Catholic Church is that it's forgotten that there's actually the virtue of prudence involved, that making law, making good law also involves the exercise of practical reason. And so, and you've got different ways of dealing with different practices. One way is, you work on the supply side, ban abortions. And, for reasons that Matt said, I think that that's going to not work so well. The other is to, ban or to work on the demand side. Why are women having abortions? What can we do to, make them think that they can carry on their life and carry the baby to term and give birth? And I think that, I'm not saying that all Catholics, and certainly not that all pro-life Catholics, but the bishops seem to have focused more over the past 40 years on supply side than demand side. And when there was a question that was asked about, will those who care about life in the womb ever be welcome in the Democratic Party? My sense is that it's never going to be the party of, get rid of Roe v. Wade and, and ban abortion. But I'd like to see the Democratic Party go back to something that was, safe, legal, and rare, which was where it was before, and really focus on as a common ground endeavor within the Democratic Party, the rare part. And what do you need to do to make it so that women don't feel like they're forced into having abortions? I think there will be a difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party on abortion, but I think that that's where the Democratic Party could go.
Yeah.
And let me just add this. I think that I don't think abortion should be an issue in this election, because it's a Supreme Court decision. That's why the Democrats have been going crazy, especially with the last nomination. They couldn't get her on her religion, so they talked about healthcare and so on. I think that was personally, I think it was a bit of a diversion. But no, it shouldn't be the issue, because the issue is going to be the court and what it says. And then you're probably going to have a checkered situation. Some states, like New York, will have abortions free and open and paid for as much as they possibly can, and some states will ban it. I think it's at that juncture that what Kathy's counseling is really true. And I would think that if the Catholic Church takes abortion seriously, yes, they would show that, would recognize all these other conditions and what Matt has recognized, and providing for women. So just as we do social work with show concern for immigrants, we've got to show for women who don't feel like they have a choice other than to abort. So yes, all these good things are going to happen, but they're going to happen in the context of whatever the Supreme Court does.
Any quick thoughts on, just to wrap up that issue? I have one more question beside this, then I'll ask for some final remarks from you. We have so many questions from viewers, but I think I'll read another bundle off. But anybody, a quick thought on that round of a topic there? No. Okay. Let me just read a couple of questions from the chat, or from the question. And here's one from Kevin Burke. And Kevin Burke says, this is for Kathleen. Could she help us think about, particularly with her work on prophetic indictment, which is very, very pointed, particular work. So I'm glad this is a person who's read your work. It might be Father Kevin Burke.
Somebody read it. That's always nice, right?
Yeah, but he's asking, given your work on prophetic indictment, Kathy, priests like Father Altman or Father Meeks and a number of more online bishops who are explicitly asserting that Catholics cannot vote for Biden because of his stance, as they imagine it, on abortion. How do you navigate those questions, Kathy?
Well, I think that you have to do two things. One thing is I think you have to back up and look at the rhetoric and say, the point of prophetic rhetoric isn't to reason together, right? I mean, the point of prophetic rhetoric is to act like a prosecutor and to say, you did this, or you are going to do this. And if you do this, you are very, very bad. So the prophetic rhetoric is a big part of American religious and political rhetoric. The American Jeremiad, has been appropriated by a lot of people, starting with the Puritans, but going down on all sides. And it really kind of cabins the discussion. So I think we need to recognize what it's doing and saying, why are you boxing me in like this? Voting is a question of prudential judgment, and we need to consider a lot of features. And so I'm not really happy with that. And then I think you need to challenge the terms they use in order to get this prophetic judgment off the ground. And a couple of those terms are, it's intrinsic evil, or it's cooperation with evil. And as I've been saying a lot, intrinsic evil doesn't mean what they think it means. It's a technical term of moral, theology, which talks about an action that's wrong by reason of its object, not by reason of its circumstance. And there are intrinsically evil acts that are not serious, like a jocose lie. You tell somebody you like their hat when you don't. There are obviously really serious intrinsically evil acts, but there are also very, very serious acts that are not intrinsically evil, that violate justice under most circumstances, like driving with a blindfold drunk. You can imagine a circumstance where it's not wrong to do that if you've got a good imagination, but the vast majority of time, that's wrong. And what this points to me that I really despair of is the loss of what Catholic thought has to give, which is it's limited, but it's got a really rich and complex moral tradition. And it's got a way to help you think about things with a mind and a heart and a conscience. And what's happened in these political debates is some of the more precise terms that we have been turned into emotional weapons and used as missiles and prophetic indictments. And that is the big cost to the Catholic tradition long term. If we dismantle our own tradition of thinking and reasoning that's been developing over centuries, in order to get one particular president elected, what are we doing to ourselves? It's a kind of self-cannibalism.
I think that's well put. I really think of Reinhold Niebuhr and that Christian realism was a great gift to culture, and we had so many more public theologians on the stage, reasonable people. We don't have that so much anymore, and that's a real loss to the tradition. Any thoughts from Matt or Ken on what Kathy was saying, prophetic indictment, things of that nature?
Yeah, I have two very quick points, and then I'll let Ken comment if he would like. But my first point is this: any priest who tells you that it's a sin to vote for Joe Biden is lying to you. That is simply the case. Joseph Ratzinger himself has said that there are proportional reasons, or if there are proportional reasons, you can vote for a pro-choice candidate. And I would submit that a catastrophic handling of a pandemic that has left hundreds of thousands of Americans dead is a proportional reason. And I would say, secondly, that my political hero is Abraham Lincoln, and he once said that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And I would say further to that end, that Catholic social teaching is not a suicide pact. You do not have to vote for Donald Trump simply because he is ostensibly pro-life. That is simply not true. There are other reasons that can inform your vote not to get totally partisan here, but the idea that you would have to simply back such a obviously incompetent and unfeeling man simply because he's pro-life is absurd. And any priest who tells you that is lying to you. And if you listen to nothing else I say tonight, that is the main point I want to drive home. Anyone who says you cannot vote for Joe Biden because you're Catholic is lying to you.
Thank you
Well,
for that conviction, Matt. Ken, do you have any thoughts on these?
yeah, very quickly. I am so pleased that hardly anybody among the bishops has said you can't vote for Joe Biden. And the one that did, who was endorsing somebody else, is from Tyler, Texas, for God's sake. Who wants to be Bishop of Tyler, Texas? So I feel sorry for him right off the bat. No, Catholics are grown up and they don't look to bishops, very few of them, to tell them how to vote or how not to vote. I just think those days
Thank
are
God.
gone.
Thank God.
Yes. Yeah, we don't, I mean, who needs it?
Archbishop Chaput former Archbishop Chaput has been very silent since he left Philadelphia. So he was somebody who used to do that quite a lot.
Yeah, but they were very much in a minority. But again, we're right back to what we said again. The bishops we like, the bishops we don't like. Commonweal versus First Things. The Register versus what do they call the Reporter? Yeah, I used to write for them. And you know that the divisions are right out there in Catholic public life.
Well, then now we're polarized. I mean, it's an amazing, being a Catholic is interesting because it is to negotiate opposites, right? It's to hold two opposite things up together and proceed as if they're not. I don't know if we can get there with politics. I mean, I had a question about what is undermining our national unity. Are you worried about peaceful transfers of power? How should Catholics behave post-election with results they don't like? Things like that. But we come to the end of our program, and I want to give you just a chance to have a final word. So maybe as you like, but maybe a minute each on just as we go into next Tuesday, what are you thinking about? How will faith be a factor, or really anything that you feel that you want to share with our viewers? Kathy, please, would you mind?
Sure. I guess I would just say two things. One, I hope that when people go into the election booth or to the voting booth, that they really do vote their conscience that's been informed, and discern who they think is the candidate that's best qualified to and will be most likely to serve the common good. I don't want to infringe on anybody else's conscience in the voting booth, just like I don't want my own conscience infringed on. And then secondly, I think it's important that we be able to say we think each other is very, very wrong about what counts as the common good or how we should prioritize our issues, and maybe even, unbelievably wrong, but not engage in a practice of excommunicating one another from the body of Christ. Because once we get into that, we're in an old heresy. All the heresies are old, but you become like a Donatist heresy where you think a certain kind of purity is the test of being Catholic. And isn't it convenient that you're the one who's defining the kind of purity? So think people are wrong, think they're totally misguided, but don't excommunicate them.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Matt, would you mind giving some closing thoughts?
Sure. I would echo what Kathy said, as I always do. And
you edit it, make it better.
Well, I don't know about that. Kathy requires very little editing, I must say. And for that matter, I think that's the case with Ken as well. We're talking to two pros here. But I would just say, one of the really interesting things to me as a Catholic writer and editor these past few years is how consistently I found Pope Francis a kind of antidote to so many of the dilemmas and controversies and dichotomies that Murph, you were pointing to just a few moments ago. I mean, Catholicism is a both and faith. And I think Pope Francis, one of the really lovely and wonderful things about him, and one of the things about him that inspires me, is the precise way in which he cuts across some of our typical political divisions. So if I had any advice to Catholics, it would be to read Fratelli Tutti. It's a really beautiful document. It's a really readable document, I must say. And read it and ponder it. And then when you go into a voting booth, really search your conscience and decide what the common good truly demands of you in this moment. And I know what that means for me, but I would encourage you to to pray and reflect about it and decide what that means for you.
Thank you, Matt.
Mhm.
Ken?
Well, I grew up before the liberal conservative divide in the church. And so I've always been uncomfortable with that. So I am both and. I relish the really good things that John Paul II did. He was a giant. I relish some of the encyclicals of his successor, Benedict, because especially the ones on death and last things, it's wonderful. And I relish what this Pope has to say. I take what's good from these people and I leave the other stuff behind. But to play one Pope off another, which is another Catholic game that I abhor, is simply ridiculous because you're not receiving what those individuals, limited though they are, gave us.
Wow. Thank you one and all. I'll just say one little memory I have. When I was a child growing up in Orange County, Fullerton, California, every year we had the elections in our garage, and my mom was the inspector, and it was a ritual for me to build the voting booths every year. And I can't tell you, I always loved politics. I was, involved in them when I was younger. And, the neighbors would come, and there's a lot of stuff happening in Orange County there. That's a ground zero for a lot of pretty hyperactive politics, especially in those years. But our neighbors, it was such a healthy community thing. People disagreed, but they didn't excommunicate each other like Catholics talking about. There wasn't a false puritanical streak. And not that I want to make any kind of naive utopianism out of this, but I just hope and pray that we can really recall ourselves to ourselves and work in peace as we move forward, and that we mind the beautiful traditions of our faith, namely the great social tradition that it has, and more, the great theological, spiritual tradition. So I don't want to always have the last word. I rarely do, but I felt like I wanted to say that. But let's have the last word be a round of applause from our viewers, and just my hearty thanks to our panelists. Good luck, and we'll see you hopefully tomorrow with Steve Millies. Otherwise, hope to see you online, and take care, and peace be with you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks,
Bye,
Kathy.
everyone.
Thanks,
Nice
Kathy.
to
Thanks,
see you all.
Megan. Thanks, Matt.